My name is June Barrett. I'm 31, and the night my father denied me in front of 80 people began with a folded card pressed into my hand. A server slipped past the registration table without slowing, left the card against my clutch, and kept walking while the string quartet played near the windows. Inside, one sentence waited in block letters: "Don't leave before your husband opens the envelope." And I carried it into the ballroom without understanding why. The club sat over dark Tacoma water, all polished wood, white linen, and the kind of soft gold lighting that flatters people who came to be admired. At the front of the room, the seating chart gave Candace Cross, my stepmother, a perfect place beside my father, and gave her daughter Erin the chair nearest him. My name was nowhere, but I had driven an hour in my mother's navy dress because 3 years of silence still felt survivable until I saw him look away. I kept moving because the only empty chair at the head table sat open like a mistake no one had fixed, and I still believed mistakes could be corrected. When my hand touched the carved top rail, my father rose so quickly his water glass shook, then fixed me with a face I barely recognized. "That seat is for my real daughter." And the force of both hands on my shoulders sent me backward off the low platform and onto hardwood. My hip struck first, then my palm, then the hem of my mother's dress split near my knee with a small, tearing sound that somehow carried farther than applause. Before I could get my breath back, Erin crossed in front of me and lowered herself into the chair I had reached for, smoothing her skirt once. Across the room, Reed stood from the back table, buttoned his jacket, and started toward us while the whole room stayed still enough to feel complicit. My mother died when I was 14, and for a few years my father and I lived inside a life where grief sat with us quietly at our table nightly. Then Candace Cross arrived with polished manners, careful perfume, and a talent for arranging rooms so thoroughly that people mistook control for help and replacement for ordinary adjustment over time. Nothing vanished all at once, which was exactly why my father kept accepting it, because every loss came disguised as efficiency, taste, or some harmless domestic improvement to him first. The framed photographs of my mother moved from the living room wall to the hallway, then disappeared entirely, and the oak table from my childhood ended up in the garage. My bedroom became Candace's sample room for linens, centerpiece mock-ups, and seating boards, while Erin began calling my father Dad in front of people who assumed she already belonged there. I grew into a preservation archivist at a university library in Seattle, which meant I spent my days saving damaged records while my own place at home kept disappearing steadily. 3 years before that party, a burst pipe flooded a special collection the week before Christmas, and I called home to say I could not leave until things were stable. After that call, my father went vomit, and Candace turned that silence into policy, telling me he needed distance whenever I called, texted, or showed up at their front door. I kept reaching anyway, leaving voicemails, sending holiday messages, and driving back twice, but each attempt ended with Candace in the doorway and my father nowhere inside the house unseen. Paula Barrett, my father's sister, noticed enough to distrust the story, but not enough to break it open, because suspicion without proof still sounds like jealousy to a tired man. By the time Reed heard from Nina Foster at the company benefits office, I had already mistaken my own restraint for dignity and my father's silence for a final answer. What had really been taken from me was smaller and worse than money, because it was my place in his memory, removed piece by piece until absence looked natural there. Candace took the microphone while I was still standing near the edge of the room, with my mother's torn hem brushing my shin above one aching knee. Her voice moved smoothly through the ballroom, warm enough to calm strangers, practiced enough to make the entire night feel polished, inevitable, and already decided before I arrived. Behind her, the slideshow began with my father's years at the company, each photograph sharpened by soft light and framed to make loyalty look simple. Then the family images started, and every one of them told the same lie with better tailoring, better posture, and cleaner editing than real life ever allows. There was my father beside Candace at charity dinners, Aaron tucked against his shoulder at birthdays, holiday tables set for three, and porch portraits taken in my childhood home. There was no trace of my mother. No trace of me. And the omission was so complete, it stopped feeling accidental before the second sequence ended. When Candace lifted her glass and called Aaron the daughter who had made my father proudest, the room answered with polite applause that sounded worse than silence. I understood then that this was not a celebration gone wrong, but a public sealing of aversion where Aaron had always belonged beside him and I had not. Even people who knew my name were already looking at the screen instead of at me, because a projected lie has an easier shape than a living interruption. After my father pushed me, Candace recovered first, smoothing one hand over the table linen and telling everyone to please continue dinner because family moments can become emotional. The words landed neatly over the room like fresh fabric, and a few people reached for their forks again, relieved to accept an explanation requiring nothing from them. She was not trying to hide what happened, only to rename it fast enough that humiliation could pass as instability and my fall could look self-inflicted. Reed reached me without rushing, offered his hand, and waited until I was standing before he looked past me toward the head table and my father. He did not raise his voice, threaten anyone, or mention the torn dress, which somehow made every eye in the room settle harder on the tear itself. Then he asked, almost mildly, "When was the last time you personally checked your beneficiary designations?" And the room lost its script. Reed stepped to the head table and placed the envelope on the white linen in front of my father, as if he were setting down something breakable. Candace moved first, angling her body between them and telling him this was not the time for confusion. But Reed never looked at her. He kept his eyes on my father and repeated the question in the same even tone. "When was the last time you personally reviewed your beneficiary designations?" My father frowned at the phrase as though it belonged to another room, another life, some dry office matter with no place inside a family disaster. Then, Reed opened the envelope and drew out two forms, laying them side by side where everyone nearest the platform could see the signatures. One was older and familiar, naming me and my mother's estate, while the newer one shifted everything to Aaron alone. My father picked up the newer page, held it closer to the chandelier light, and stared at the signature long enough for the room to stop pretending. The confusion left his face first, then the anger, and what replaced them was a slower, more frightening recognition that made Candace take one step back. "That is not how I sign my name." And even before anyone answered, the sentence had already cracked the night open. Candace tried to gather the pieces at once. Insisting paperwork gets messy. Forms get retyped. Offices make clerical mistakes. And people were making malicious assumptions. Reed reached into the envelope again and placed a printed email trail beside the forms. Then a residential IP log. Then the submission timestamp. Before Candace could reshape that too, Nina Foster rose from a side table and crossed the room with the steady walk of someone bringing procedure into a place built on performance. Nina stopped near the platform and explained that my father had always handled retirement changes in per person, never through a personal Gmail account, never through unsigned digital shortcuts. She had flagged the request because the signature pattern differed from earlier documents, and because the file arrived from a home connection instead of company channels. What had sounded like family accusation a minute earlier now sat on the table as an administrative irregularity with dates, times, and a traceable origin. My father had not touched his water, but his fingers closed tightly around the glass while Reed set down one final stack from the envelope. It was my call history. Line after line of weekend attempts spanning 3 years, each one landing on the same number my father carried in his pocket. He looked at the pages, then at me, and the disbelief in his face was so raw it made the whole ballroom feel suddenly smaller. "I never saw these." And the sentence came out thin because Reed was already telling him to open his settings and check blocked contacts. My father pulled out his phone with hands that no longer looked steady, tapped through the screen, and then stopped completely when my number appeared there. Candace did not deny it fast enough, and that hesitation let the truth arrive before her excuse did. She pivoted anyway, saying she had protected him from stress, from old wounds, from my manipulation, from the way I always dragged him backward. Reed said nothing this time because he did not need to. Not after the blocked number and the email logs were already sitting under the lights. Candace kept talking until fear outran strategy, and she blurted that Aaron needed security after her debts. And that was the first moment Aaron looked afraid too. Paula Barrett rose from the second table near the windows. Not dramatically. Not trembling. Just with the weary steadiness of someone tired of being ignored. She looked at my father, then at the phone still open to my blocked number, and reminded him she had warned him for years, repeatedly. What Candace built was deliberate, but what destroyed us was your willingness to accept every convenient version that spared you from asking harder questions yourself. That landed harder than the forged signature because the papers proved a crime, while Paula's voice pinned something uglier to the table beside it there. My father sat down again, stared at the forms, and for the first time looked less betrayed than ashamed by how easily he had yielded. Reed stepped back without adding another word, leaving the silence to do its work, now that evidence and memory had finally collided in public there. Aaron tried one last distinction, that she never touched the signature, but her face changed when I asked whether she knew my calls were blocked. She held my gaze for one suspended beat too long, and that pause told the room more than any clean denial ever could that night. I understood then that wanting a father had been true for her, but benefiting from my erasure had been true at the same time too. No one in that room could leave my father blameless anymore, because the blocked number sat glowing in his hand like his own negligence there. He had been lied to. Yes, but he had also chosen comfort over friction. And that choice had cost me 3 full years with him. By the time he finally looked at me, I was no longer waiting to be chosen, only waiting to see whether he could bear truth. My father stood with my number still open on his phone, then looked down at the torn hem of my mother's dress before he crossed the room. The distance between us was not far, but every step carried the weight of the chair, the shove, the silence, and the years. When he stopped in front of me, his face looked older than it had an hour earlier, stripped of certainty and left with nothing except what he had done. He did not reach for me, which mattered, because the bruise in my hip and the split in the silk were still there between us. Instead, he faced the room first and admitted what everyone had just watched him become. A father who let lies feel easier than love. I owe my daughter an apology, and I heard the words land across linen, glassware, and lowered eyes that had nowhere else to go. Then he turned back to me and gave the apology the room had earned by witnessing the damage and the truth both together. He apologized for pushing me, for believing I had abandoned him, for letting my mother's photographs disappear, and for accepting a version of home that required my absence. He did not ask me to understand, did not tell me grief made him weak, and did not beg for instant forgiveness, which was the first honest thing left in him. I told him I accepted the apology, but acceptance was not trust, and one did not become the other because a room went quiet. What happened tonight stays true even if we repair something later. And if we start again, we start where the damage actually is. He nodded once, slowly, the way men do when agreement costs them something real and they know pretending otherwise will finish the collapse. Candace tried one final turn, accusing Reed and me of staging the whole thing to ruin his retirement in front of colleagues and friends. My father stopped her without looking away from me and said the seating chart, the slideshow, and the public replacement of his daughter had all been her work. Erin stood at the edge of the platform with her bag in both hands, went pale under the lights, and ended it with 4 words that left Candace alone. "It's over. Mom." Candace left first. Carrying her evening bag like posture alone could protect her from what had already reached the table and stayed there. Nina took the forms. The email trail. and the call records with her. Because what began as humiliation had hardened into something official. Erin followed without looking back, and the chair she had taken beside my father remained empty long enough to feel like evidence. My father turned toward that empty chair, touched its back once, then pulled it away from the table and set it beside him for me. I sat because refusing would have turned the moment into theater again, and I had already spent enough of that night inside somebody else's design. Reed stayed near my shoulder. Paula took the seat across from us, and the 4 places that remained felt smaller, plainer, and more honest than the room had all evening. In the days that followed, the beneficiary change was frozen. The company opened its review, and my father finally started using his own phone instead of living around it. When I went back to his house, the old oak table had been pulled out of the garage. My mother's photograph was back on the wall, and the blocked list was empty. The seam in my dress was mended but still visible at the knee, and I left it that way because having my place returned did not erase the tear that came first. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the part of healing that arrives slowly. Honestly, and without pretending the damage never happened. I hope you find love that feels safe, peace that stays, and the strength to keep your heart open